Hello everyone, it's Channin here for Pinkfresh Studio. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to use Pinkfresh's layering stencils. We're going to use them with the stamp set, and I'm going to show you two different ways, starting with the stamped image or starting with the stencils themselves. So for today's video, I'm going to be using the Floral Bunch stamp set, stencils, and die. This is a gorgeous cluster of flowers and leaves and a bunch of sentiments. Here you can see the stencil set, the layering stencil set. This set comes with 6 stencils. You do need multiple stencils, or the layering sets do come with multiple stencils to create all those different colors or layers of colors to really add depth to the image. I'm going to start by stamping that cluster of flowers from the stamp set in detailed black onto an A2 panel of white cardstock. An A2 panel is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Here are the layering stencils for this set. There are 6, and each stencil is labeled with what one it is. So this one, you can see in the upper left corner, it says stencil 1. This is really helpful to not only know what stencil it is, but also to know the front, because you want to make sure you can read it. And at the bottom lower left corner, it does say Pinkfresh Studios. When I'm stenciling, I like to add 2 long pieces of low tack tape to either side of my panel. I'm using micro pour tape here. You could use painter's tape or even a washi tape. This is just going to make switching out my stencils really quick and easy. So I looked through the stencil and lined up the opening of those flowers with the stamped image. And now I'm ready to ink blend. I just stuck it down and ready to ink blend. I am ink blending these flowers very quickly with lemon whip, a nice light yellow. Once I finish ink blending these, I'll then remove my stencil and I'm ready for my next layer. So this is stencil number 2 here, and I'm just going to again look through the stencil and kind of line up the opening in the stencil with the stamped image. I find it's helpful to kind of look for large openings and match those up with the stamped image. Those are a little bit easier than trying to use smaller openings. So I quickly ink blended that with fresh pear, and now we're on to stencil number 3. Now this one I'm using kind of the center of the flowers. Those are kind of the largest openings in this layer. And once I get those kind of lined up, I'm ready to ink blend my next color. I'm ink blending all the openings here with Peach Fuzz, a really pretty light orange. Then I'll remove that stencil, and we're already on to stencil number 4, so we're already past halfway. Now this layer I'm lining up a little bit differently. I'm not using the openings this time in the stencil. I'm actually using the centers that you see on the flowers, the kind of masked centers, and lining those up with the centers of the stamped image. And I quickly ink blended the center of those flowers with Sweet Mustard, a really beautiful honeyed kind of yellow. So now we're moving on to the detail layer for the leaves, and this happens to be stencil number 5, and I just lined up those detail layers. Typically there's a stamp line that's kind of like the vein of the leaves, and you can kind of use that line to help you line up that detail layer for the leaves. And I quickly ink blended that with olive. Now this is my last stencil. This is the little bit of detail on the flower centers and the little kind of sprigs of flowers. And I'm using really rich red here, or orange. This is Persimmon, to ink blend that. And that actually completes my image. You can see here how beautiful this floral cluster is and all the depth we get from using those different colors of ink with the layering stencils. So now that this is all ink blended and stamped, I'm going to go ahead and use the matching die and line it up, and then use a couple pieces of micro pour tape to hold it in place and run it through my die cutting machine. And now I'm ready to use this on my card. So now that we've done stenciling with a stamped image, now I'm going to show you how to use the layering stencils just by themselves. So all the stencils have these guide corners on them, and those guide corners will line up to an A2 panel, which is again 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I have an A2 panel of white cardstock. I just centered it within those guide corners, and now I'm all lined up and ready to start ink blending. I'm going to use a different color palette this time. I'm starting with Bubblegum, which is a beautiful pink, and I'm going to do those flowers with that pretty pink color. Now I'm ready to move on to stencil number 2. Again, looking through the stencil, lining up my panel with the corners, the corner guides on the stencil, And then I'm ready to ink blend all the greenery. This time I'm using key lime for all the leaves. Once I finish that, I'll remove my stencil, and now I'm ready for stencil number 3. Now this one I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm actually going to use 2 colors for this stencil. I'm going to ink blend all of the flowers here with a lemon whip, and once I finish ink blending that, I'm going to move on to the centers of my pink flowers. I'm going to use Apricot, which is a beautiful orange. This is something to consider too with your stencils. You don't necessarily have to just use one color for one stencil. If your images or your openings are far enough away, you can definitely get away with ink blending with multiple colors. And that's a fun way to kind of change the image as well. Now for this stencil, I'm using Raspberry Bliss for the center of those pink flowers to really create some nice contrast between that bubblegum and really add depth. And I do want to take a note here about my color choices, or how I pick colors when I look at these, when I'm using these layering stencils. I always first start by looking how many stencils and how many layers are for each image. So for the leaves, that's kind of how I separate it by leaves and flowers. Typically leaves have 2 layers, kind of a base for the leaf and then a vein, and then your flowers can have about 3 to 4 layers. Sometimes the centers of the flowers will be like an additional 2 more layers. So, and that's kind of, once I figure out how many layers my images have, then I know kind of how many colors I'm going to need to pick out and whether I want to start with a light or a dark. Typically for a base of a leaf or a base of a flower, I'll start with a lighter color, and then the detail layer I will go a little bit darker, and that's to create that contrast. So that's basically how I pick out. So we completely ink blended this. You could definitely use this image as is. It's beautiful. But if you want to stamp on top of it with the linear image of the flowers, all you have to do is grab that stamp, line it up with your ink blended flowers, and then just stamp it right on top. And you'll have a gorgeous kind of a detail line that really kind of makes this pop. And I love how beautiful these flowers look in a different color palette. They're both gorgeous. So now that we finished our 2 floral clusters, we're actually ready to make some cards. I did make one more floral cluster with the pinks and yellows that I did for that second one. Just kind of switched the colors around a little bit to make them a little bit to make it look a little bit different, but still match. Now for my first card, I'm going to make an A2 card, and I trimmed down this piece of pattern paper from the Super Cool pack down to an A2 panel, adhered it onto an A2 top folding white card base. Now I'm ready for my florals. I've added some foam adhesive to the back side of them. Now I'm just going to remove the backing and then center this onto my card front. And then we'll move on to my sentiment. This sentiment also comes from the Floral Bunch stamp set, and I've stamped it in Versamark ink onto some gray cardstock, poured on some white embossing powder, and heat set it. Now I'm just adding some foam adhesive to the back, doubling up the adhesive on the right side to support it, because that side isn't over the dimensional flowers. And then I'll just stick that down, and that will actually complete my A2 card. We're now going to move on to my second card with my other 2 clusters of flowers, starting with this slimline diagonal stitched plaid panel. I just used the die to add that beautiful stitch detail to a slimline panel, and now I'm going to adhere it on to this slimline card base, which again, a slimline card base is 7 1/4 by 8 5/8, and then you just score it at 3 5/8. Now I've arranged my floral clusters, used some tape to hold them in place while I trim off the excess. I want to trim this off first before I stick them down because I want to use some foam adhesive. It's a little bit tricky to kind of trim off the excess if you've added the foam adhesive first. So now I'll just remove my tape that was just kind of temporarily holding those flowers in place, and I'll start to add my foam adhesive. And I'll add my foam adhesive to both of my floral clusters, remove the backing, and then just place them on the corners of my card front. Once I finish sticking those down, all I have left to do is my sentiment. Again, I created my sentiment earlier off camera. I just stamped it on to some gray cardstock and then white heat embossed it. Now I'm going to remove some of the foam tape backing that I've added to the back side to give it a little bit of dimension, and then stick it down, and that will actually complete my second card. I'll now hold both my cards up to the camera so we can get a good look at all the details. I love how this slimline card turned out. I think the flowers look so pretty at the two corners of the card front. And here's our very first card and our very first floral cluster. Love the yellows and oranges in that color palette. I just think it pairs really well with the pattern paper. I hope you guys found this video helpful for how to use the layering stencils either with the stamped image first or adding your stamped image second. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.